Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, a few days ago, I did a poll on Patreon and asked our patrons to choose between several videos for our next reaction, and this was the clear and overwhelming winner of that poll. This is the gold scandal, Ulysses S. Grant. This is part of a series on presidential corruption in U.S. history by our friends at Extra History. So we're going to take a look at this one today. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out without my commentary. If you want to be a part of the future polls, you can sign up on Patreon. I believe at tier 2 on up, you get to vote on those polls. So you can check out the link below to our Patreon, see all the different perks that are available at the different levels. I want to give a shout out and a thank you to Jackson Lord, who is one of our supporters through Patreon. Couldn't do it without people like you, Jackson. Thank you so much. Let's dive in.
Mount McGregor, New York, July 18th, 1885.
Oh, starting with the end.
Ulysses S. Grant finally puts down his pen. His memoirs complete. Famously introverted, Grant has resisted writing anything autobiographical until now, even as other Civil War generals did so. But this is his last chance to correct the record and defend his legacy. For Grant, a lifelong smoker, is terminally ill with throat cancer.
So, yeah, lifelong in terms of the last part of his life. Just some background on the whole smoking thing. He was an occasional pipe smoker, but he was never really a heavy smoker. Gets into the American Civil War, and there's this image that is broadcast all over. I mean, broadcast, I know is not the right word, but that is sent out all over the country of him smoking a cigar when he wins the first great Union victory of the war at Fort Donelson. And so these thousands of cigars get sent to him, and he starts smoking them, and he starts just non-stop smoking. It's like 20 cigars a day. So at that point, he's in his early 40s. So, yeah, I guess that's about what he is. 1822 he was born, so he's right around 40. So, yeah, the last 20 years, so like the last third of his life.
Swallowing anything down his swollen throat brings agonizing pain, and he has to communicate with a chalk and slate.
Yeah, he actually said that drinking water was like drinking molten lead. Like it was just awful.
So, he has been writing nonstop for 4 months, often 50 pages a day. Despite being a consequential and popular two-term president after the war, the bulk of his writings only focus on events up to the end of the Civil War. Only the final chapter is a reflection on the consequences of the war and his hopes for the nation, but it does not discuss or defend his time in the White House. Perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot here that we could go into, and I've done other videos talking about Grant, so I won't belabor the point, but he's willing himself to stay alive long enough to do this so he can leave his family in a good situation because of some bad financial deals that he got swindled on. And yeah, he knows that the audience primarily wants to hear about the wartime years. And so I wish he had written more about his pre-war years and about his post-war years, but that wasn't what he chose to focus on. But it's a fantastic read. If you ever want to get into the memoirs of a Civil War general, his is the one to do. I've read Sherman's, I've read Longstreet's, I've read a few others. Grant's is by far the best.
He hasn't the strength for it, or perhaps he does not want to ruminate on his administration's parade of corruption scandals, as men he considered friends took advantage of him. After all, that betrayal still feels fresh. He's only decided to write his memoirs now because his family needs the money. You see, Grant had lost everything to a Ponzi scheme orchestrated by yet another false friend. The memoir.
I've said this often, but if we are to talk about faults with Grant, obviously a lot of people talk about his drinking. I'm not a doctor, I'm not an expert in these matters, but I wouldn't strictly label Grant as an alcoholic. I think he was a binge drinker who couldn't hold his liquor. He didn't drink all the time like you might typically see from an alcoholic. He could go months, if not years, without drinking. But then when he would drink, it was bad. And he'd have 1 or 2 drinks of whiskey, and he was done. I mean, he was just trashed out of his mind. And it was typically when nothing was going on. He was bored. His family wasn't around, things like that. But all of that said, I think the great weakness of Ulysses S. Grant is that he's far too trusting of people. And people who are unsavory characters, whether they are in his personal life with his finances or members of his cabinet, would take advantage of that.
Goes to the publisher, Mark Twain, and will be a massive bestseller to a country grieving a national hero. Yep. For 5 days after putting down his pen, Ulysses S. Grant is dead. But his administration's scandals lived on. Today's cautionary tale of presidential corruption is brought to you by our independent streaming service, Nebula. Probably the number one thing you know about the administration of Ulysses S. Grant, if you've been taught anything, is that it was considered the most corrupt in American history, until recently. But honestly, that is a huge shame, because Ulysses S. Grant is one of the most transformative presidents the United States has ever had.
So, corruption and scandals like the ones that happened during the Grant administration tend to be those things that are, I think, heavily weighted during the time in which they happen, right? Those are things that are viewed in the short term as super important. It's the same thing with someone like Richard Nixon or Warren Harding or any of the other times that we've had corruption happening during administrations. It's not to downplay those things as being wrong. It's to say that as time progresses, other things begin to weigh heavier and the corruption seems to diminish. And I think that's one of the reasons why Grant's administration is increasingly seen more positively, is because we're looking more at things like his civil rights record, which was very, very good. His taking down of the Klan, his destruction of that organization, his setting up of the Justice Department to help to make sure that the Klan was taken down and other groups. So we're focusing more on those things and less on the corruption because I think that's what we tend to do.
Having won the Civil War and taken over from Andrew Johnson, who seemed happy to surrender that win to restore the pre-war status quo, Grant pursued an aggressive policy of civil rights expansion. In his 2 terms, he extended unambiguous citizenship to Black Americans, fought discrimination, extended the vote to Black men, and formed the Justice Department to investigate civil rights cases.
Yep.
And when vigilante groups like the Klan and Red Shirts used violence and intimidation to try to curtail those rights, he responded with military force. Ironically, America's general president would end up managing what amounted to a counterinsurgency campaign within American territory, trying to...
100% true. That's absolutely, and I think that's how Grant viewed it and how many of his generals viewed it. It was a counterinsurgency that was happening.
Defend newly elected Black legislators, Republican office holders, Freedmen's Bureau agents, and voters from a campaign of terrorist violence and massacres. Grant also, mind you, had to take the reins from Andrew Johnson, a top candidate for the worst president we've ever had, who, oh my gosh, that is a long bit there, Rob. Listen, sorry, buddy, we don't have time for a big old screed about your blood-curdling hatred about Andrew Johnson, okay?
But I hope we'll get to it at some point because it's perfectly justified. And a lot of people don't realize Grant actually served as a cabinet member under Johnson, because Grant was the general-in-chief of the Army. He gets his 4th star in 1866 after the war, and he serves as general-in-chief. But when Edwin Stanton, who was Secretary of War, is suspended in the hoopla that eventually leads to Johnson's impeachment, Grant was the acting Secretary of War during that time, and Grant's a guy who famously had a difficult time saying overly negative things about people, but it is very, very clear from history, but also from his memoirs, that Grant did not like Johnson.
Buddy, where are you going? Come on, we can do a short on it. That'll be good. Andrew Johnson's the worst. Anyway, at the same time, Grant was also, in many ways, the first president of the Gilded Age. He oversaw the linking of the Transcontinental Railroad, economic boom and bust, and a huge expansion of American industry and prosperity. The opening and settlement of new territory in the West unlocked both American resources and industry, vaulting the United States into a nation of industrial and financial titans.
So think of the aftermath of both World War I and World War II, which you have these massive wars that involve a lot of ramping up of industry and mobilization and all these things that are happening. And then as part of that, you have a big kick in the pants of the economy. In the aftermath of World War One, then you had the booming 20s, the roaring 20s, and then you have the crash, and you have the depression in the 30s. And then things kind of ramp back up. You hit World War II, and then you have another boom with the baby boom, and with the 1950s where we're building the interstate highways, and you have a lot of suburbs coming into being, and a lot more home ownership, and all this stuff. Something similar is happening in the American Civil War aftermath, where you have this kickstart to the economy. You have a lot of fresh immigration happening, and then things go horribly, horribly wrong.
While the stock market and commodities trading had existed previously, they would be supercharged in the aftermath of the war. And this was particularly important because Grant's Republican Party was increasingly allied with big business. Similarly, Grant was elected to head an expanded federal government that was more powerful than it was before the war. It was also taxing a greater number of income streams and goods. So not only was the state itself more apt to wield power, it had way more access to money. And as we'll see through this series, many of these forces of Reconstruction, of capital, and expanded government would collide to create the scandals of the Grant administration.
The same thing happened in the aftermath of the American Revolution when the country was just getting on its feet. You had all kinds of new opportunities because you have new land opening up. You have all these land grants that are given to veterans. You have the expansion of the country economically, but also in territory. You have all of these new trade deals being made with countries as the United States is new. And into that vacuum of new opportunities will come unsavory people. It always happens because humanity is humanity.
Industry and stock speculators would try to pull more strings in government. There were more tax revenues to skim from if people had the mind to do so. And those who hated Grant's Reconstruction policies of expanded civil rights would find the corruption a convenient avenue of attack against a well-liked president whose party held the levers of power.
I love how they've set all this up. I think that's the perfect way of presenting the circumstances that created these opportunities that Grant is in the middle of. And listen, we're talking about the Grant administration, and the buck stops here. He's the president, even though he had never really been a politician before this. And ultimately, the responsibility rests with him. But to my understanding, and I'm sure they're going to get into this, there's no indication that Grant was directly involved in these corruption schemes. He just unfortunately was not very on top of it.
But the irony in all of this is that Grant himself was, pretty much everyone agreed, an extremely honest person who didn't participate in the corruption that his administration would become known for. Now, of course, that is not to say he should totally be absolved either, because though Grant was personally honest, he definitely suffered errors of judgment, particularly when it came to trusting people that he, by all rights, should have been suspicious of. He was loyal almost to a fault, and being overall honest himself, had a hard time imagining that people close to him would be anything else but the same. Plus, whenever any of these friends' misdeeds were exposed, he often continued to defend them. Throughout his life, this lack of guile would put him behind in business, and as mentioned at the top of the episode, would send him deeply into debt and nearly bankrupt his family toward the end of his life.
And it's so unfortunate, and this is just true in life, right, that people who go out of their way to be honest people, not are perfect people. We're not saying Grant was perfect. He was not a perfect person at all. But people who try really hard to be honest in the process get taken advantage of, and in the process end up permitting dishonesty to take place because of their own personal attitudes. And so it's almost that you could argue that you need to have a little bit of that kind of deviousness and that hard-headed nature and that willingness to go after people in order to protect a country or a military that you're leading from being corrupted. It's just the sad reality of humanity.
In fact, much of Grant's appeal as a presidential candidate was that he was seen as a simple, honorable soldier at a time when politics was extremely dirty and partisan. This was helped in part by the fact that Grant was an extreme introvert. Oh, he lit up when speaking one-on-one with people he knew well, but in group settings, he often was reserved and quiet, chewing over information and not speaking much.
And that's why a lot of people, when they first met Grant, were really surprised because, you hear things about a person and by the time a lot of these people meet Grant, he's this war hero and he's done all these things and he's unconditional surrender Grant. And then they walk into a room and it's very opposite from someone like George Washington, who everybody said when he walked into the room, you just knew he commanded the room. Grant was the total opposite of that.
Come to earn the nickname Grant the Silent, and even close friends and colleagues could rarely tell what he was thinking until he came to a decision. This meant that Grant, when he was suggested as a presidential candidate, didn't have a long record of controversial statements that might alienate voting blocs.
Right.
And boy, was that saying a lot in the late 1860s, when almost every national figure had dirtied themselves in partisan warfare. In 1868, Grant was unanimously nominated at the Republican Convention and went on to dominate the Electoral College.
And the Democrats wanted him too. If he was willing to, he could have run as a Democrat and they would have gladly put him at the head of their ticket.
Winning 214 to 80. He also won 53% of the popular vote, largely on the strength of 400,000 ballots cast in his favor by Black Americans.
Yep.
But here's another thing you gotta know about Grant. He had zero political experience, which led to his first minor scandal. See, while Grant had been commanding general of the U.S. Army from 1864 to 1869 and acting Secretary of War for about 5 months, he'd only worked with the executive branch and had no experience dealing with Congress.
Right.
He also had little idea and less regard for how Washington politics worked. For instance, the spoils system was a tradition of political patronage, which had been growing since Andrew Jackson's administration.
And so what do you do if you are someone with no political experience? Well, you bring in people who do have that experience and you leave it to them. But that means you're hands off and you're not paying attention to what's happening, but it's all being done in your name. And so it reflects back on you.
Where the winning party in an election would give government jobs and appointments to supporters, family members, friends, and political
nepotism.
allies. Literally, to the victors go the spoils kind of stuff. And often, these appointees were given the jobs regardless of ability. By the time Grant came into office, the spoils system was as entrenched as it was despised, and there were increasing calls for public service reform. Ironically, Grant got in trouble for not following the spoils system. Sure, he still gave jobs to family and friends, particularly his wife Julia's family, who were always leaning on him for special favors. People found that a bit uncouth, but it didn't quite rise to the level of a scandal. No. The actual violation was that he didn't consult powerful Republican congressmen when building out his cabinet.
Right, and this is what sets him apart from someone like Lincoln, who was a brilliant politician, who was very, very, very good, maybe the best at reading the room, knowing whose feathers needed to be smoothed out when they got ruffled, who he needed to have conversations with, who he needed to consult when making decisions so that they felt like they were being heard, how to bring different groups of people together. Grant could not be further from that.
And, in fairness, if he had, he'd probably have avoided some easy blunders. For example, he stuffed his cabinet full of personal friends regardless of merit, leading to several embarrassing withdrawals. He named his lifelong friend Elihu Washburn Secretary of State.
So Elihu Washburn was the congressman probably most responsible for Grant's rise to significant power in the Civil War. Illinois congressman who really just had Grant's back and was always promoting him, always championing him, always fighting for him to be given a seat at the table. And that was rewarded by the fact that Grant turned out to be someone who was worth giving that power and authority to in the Civil War.
But between Washburn being ill and Congress being furious, he only served 11 days before resigning and being made minister to France. Similarly, he nominated his friend Alexander Stewart, the Secretary of the Treasury, but Congress blocked the appointment based on a law that the Secretary of the Treasury could not import foreign goods. Stewart owned a chain of dry goods stores. But then Stewart had also bought Grant a house after the war, which Grant unwisely had accepted. This was in fact one of a number of large gifts given to Grant in appreciation that he'd later come to find had strings attached.
Yeah, there was a lot of that going on after the war where people gave him gifts, and he and his family went on this long, worldwide tour afterwards, very popular, which was nice for Grant because he had been relatively poor most of his life.
Or an expectation of favors in return. Probably his best initial pick was John Rawlins for Secretary of War. Rawlins had been Grant's chief of staff during the Civil War itself and was widely respected. He also had a nose for shady characters that Grant lacked.
And Rawlins, I think the most important thing that Rawlins had going for him was that he was one of those friends that we all need in our lives, and if you don't have one, you need to get one, who was willing to tell Grant the things he needed to hear, not just the things he wanted to hear. Rawlins was the guy who would hold Grant's feet to the fire when it came to alcohol during the war. He was a guy who could say things to Grant and they would be received. Because, that's what a good friend does. They tell us the things we need to hear out of love because they care about us. And sometimes we need people to tell us, you know what, you're being an idiot right now. I love you. Stop being an idiot. And Rawlins was good at that.
And had served to protect Grant from schemers before. Unfortunately, he also had tuberculosis and died 5 months into the Grant administration at the age of 38.
And that would have been really helpful if he'd been able to stick around. And he's buried right in front of Robert E. Lee's house in Arlington in a big plot that's got a lot of Civil War generals in it.
Honestly, if he hadn't, I don't believe this series would be 3 episodes long.
Yeah.
Anyway, the debacle with the cabinet set up Grant for conflicts within his own party, especially among the blue-blooded, old family New England types that felt they'd been spurned by what they considered an unrefined frontier-born bumpkin. Shortly afterward, he got in minor trouble with Congress for sending his private secretary, Orville Babcock, to investigate a possible annexation of Santo Domingo, the current-day Dominican Republic. While there, Babcock exceeded his authority by drafting and signing a treaty to lease a bay on behalf of the United States as a forerunner to annexation.
And you know what? Honestly, it wasn't a bad plan that Grant had. And he had a lot of the details worked out for this, but then he ran into trouble with people in his own party in the Senate who he just could not get on board with this.
Yeah, when Congress found out, they understandably blew their top. After all, treaties are supposed to be signed by Congress, and Grant had allowed Babcock to freelance without even involving the Secretary of State. This particularly put Grant and Babcock at odds with the venerable Charles Sumner, one of the most powerful Republicans in the Senate, who would increasingly confront Grant and become a mortal enemy of Babcock.
And this is the same Charles Sumner who had been nearly beaten to death on the floor of the Senate by Southern congressmen in the years building up to the Civil War.
Of course, this would not be the last time Babcock got in trouble either. For if corruption in the Grant administration had a face, it would be this mustachioed one right here. In fact, this whole Santo Domingo scheme, which Congress killed, by the way, is a perfect example of how Grant's personal political naivete and tendency to run the cabinet like a military HQ led to scandal. The West Point graduate Babcock had been Grant's aide during the war, where he was a brilliant and daring military engineer, but he was also pretty unscrupulous and didn't follow proper procedure, faults that Grant was blind to even when presented evidence.
Yeah.
Now, this Santo
and that's where it gets really hard to defend Grant. And if you know anything about me, I am a huge fan of Ulysses S. Grant, the man. Probably my all-time favorite American. And it doesn't hurt that he's from Ohio. But it's really hard. It's one thing to say, you know what, he was naive and he trusted people too easily. But the fact that he also, when presented with evidence, still refused to believe it, that's hard to justify.
Bingo scheme mostly did happen behind closed doors, mind you. Meaning, the first truly public scandal was the Black Friday gold panic of 1869. When Grant entered the presidency, he wanted to deal with the economy's massive national debt from the Civil War and pay back those who had bought U.S. war bonds. As a result, he instructed his Secretary of the Treasury to sell 1 million of the Treasury's gold per week while paying off the national debt. This also kept the price of gold under control. However, a pair of Wall Street speculators, James Fisk and Jay Gould, concocted a scheme to corner the market on gold.
And this is what I was saying going back to the revolution. It's this whole idea, these speculators, these people who come along and see a chance to get rich off of a government program. And boy, if that doesn't sound like stuff that has gone on for the entire 250 years of our country's history, I don't know what does.
In order to control its price. That basically means buying a monopoly on a commodity and pumping its value. So they enlisted into this plot Abel Corbin, who, wouldn't you know it, had just married Grant's sister. Over the summer of 1869, Gould and Fisk, and separately Corbin, lobbied Grant in person to stop the Treasury selling gold while quietly buying up a bank to make their own gold purchases. They'd also managed to maneuver an ally into the position of Assistant Treasurer of the United States, then bribed him $10,000 to inform them of the government's gold moves. However, Gould and Fisk's most dramatic move came on June 5th, when they offered Grant the use of their steamship to get from New York to Boston, and while on board had him cornered, tried to convince him that ceasing the gold sales would be good for farmers and the railroad they jointly owned. Grant, as per usual, stayed silent. Eventually, Grant did cede the gold sales, after being advised to by a third party who was actually not in on the plot, truly thinking it would boost agriculture. And the gold ring took it as success. They pumped the
So now these guys think that they're the ones who convinced Grant to do this.
price of gold higher and higher, raising it from $137 per ounce to $160 per ounce in just over a week. As the price rose to astronomical highs, Grant became suspicious, especially of his brother-in-law's sudden interest in buying gold in the name of other family members, and how his dear new brother kept pestering him to please, pretty please, not dump more gold into the market in a telegram he, in a frankly surreal scene, received while playing croquet. Meanwhile, Grant's Treasury Secretary warned him the rising price of gold could crash the economy, so Grant decided to crash the price of gold instead. In an almost comically spiteful move, they dropped $4 million of gold into the market unannounced on September 23rd, sending the price of gold tumbling and ruining Gould and Fisk's corner. In the gold trading room at the New York Stock Exchange, the news was met with utter panic. Men melted down, fortunes were lost, and the stock market plunged. As a result of the crash, food prices then dropped.
It's unfortunate because you're trying to combat potential corruption, but in the process, a lot of people, and this is what always happens when corruption happens, when people are trying to game the system, is that people who have nothing to do with it, who are just trying to live their lives and get by, are the ones who end up suffering.
Creating an economic disaster for farmers who depended on high prices and demand for staple crops. It caused a multi-month economic downturn and created the term Black Friday. A congressional investigation tried to tie the scandal to Grant, claiming that his brother-in-law Corbin had made gold purchases in the name of both Grant's wife and sister, but, nothing really stuck. But, fun fact, later it would come out that Babcock was also trading gold, so look at you, still scheming. Got my eye on you. For most of the public, Grant gave a satisfactory answer in a statement given to the newspaper, that he had no part in the scheme except to end it.
And you can look at the evidence of what people could see publicly, and that seems to make sense. And Grant has a lot of political capital. He has a lot of goodwill on his side. Obviously, like a lot of things, that's going to erode over time, but for now, he's still got that.
But the Black Friday gold panic would be a footnote in the scandals to come. From a corruption ring in the New York Custom House, to skimming whiskey taxes, to bribery in the awarding of postal routes, embezzling from the military, starting a war in order to seize gold on Lakota lands, and a fake heist to frame a political opponent.
All right, that was a good start. They said there's 2 more episodes, so we'll definitely be getting into those very soon. I want to thank Bessie in Alberta, Canada, and also Robert Dittmar. Thank you both for your support on Patreon. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.